All right. So we might have a few other people watching online. Good morning. Came out at 11 degrees to warm up with some book discussion. Fantastic. Okay. 9 in your. Okay, people watching on the live stream, that was not for you. The gold kudos are for the ones that showed up in 11-degree morning. Okay, so today we're gonna just gonna get through this chapter called Errors, which is chapter 4, and then so he talks about the problems where there are problems in the information technologies in terms of, and he's really has his axe to grind against religious institutions. Then we got one session in March and one in April. So in March, we'll talk about how he talks about then how this applies to democracies and totalitarian structures, and how truth is dealt with there. So we'll look at that sort of more contemporary historical spread. And then on the last session in April, we'll talk about how it applies to AI and going through the future. So that's what we'll do for the next two. But I want to focus on this book, on this chapter called Errors, which is chapter, where is it? It's called Errors, the Fantasy of Infallibility. It's chapter 4 in the book. It starts on page 70. Because this chapter was the one that really irked me. So, and I feel so split about it, because Harari is one of the smartest people in the world, and yet he seems to just completely misunderstand how religion works. And I'll take you through that, and how it doesn't hurt his basic theory, but it causes some problems. And and his basic point is that where we stopped last week is he's talking about how this is the connection with sapiens, right? That humans, the difference between humans and other apes is that we figured out how to tell stories. And by tell stories, we're able to expand the size of our communities and expand cooperation beyond the 150 to 200 people. That's the most that can exist in a single tribe of apes or proto-humans, right? And it's because we can connect with stories. And then the next leap of technology is then when the story is written down. So it's the invention of writing. And that's what I talked about last week. And I mentioned last week how for us at Temple Israel, the best line in this book is page 420, note 13, when it mentions Iris Bar, because it acknowledges him for his book, a book that he was the editor of cuneiform text that Harari is citing. But in this book, in this chapter, he talks about books and how errors come into books. So I want to start, because I'm a very annoying reader in that I read all the footnotes and I always finding mistakes in books I'm reading, and I always mark them up. And there's often mistakes in the footnotes, because the way that publishing works is that footnotes are never copyrighted as carefully as the regular part of the book. There's always mistakes in the footnotes and errors. For example, I found a great error in his book, page 439, note 68. Now, you have that's the paperback. Can I see page 439? I wonder if it's corrected. And then I'll show you what it is. Probably not, because no one else would have noticed this.
You said they noticed or did you know?
No one else would have noticed it. Note 68. Oh, it's a different pagination.
Page, different number of page.
Well,
It's so
68.
Is it a different edition or different thing? I do read forwards and prologues, but not footnotes.
Something different.
So he renumbered his footnotes?
No, it just the pages are different. Something, he might have added a new preface. So the footnotes, you wouldn't have probably added a new preface. Yeah, it's still wrong. Okay, it's not corrected. So the mistake was, sorry? Well, I might write to the publisher, but was that? And it's funny because I was just last week in Barnes & Noble and I noticed that they were selling it in paperback on the new nonfiction stuff. So, but I'm sure it'll keep reprinting. He says, it's 68. It's not even our chapter, it's the next chapter. He's quoting a paper on Taoism in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and it's from the website. And he gives the website, and you know what you're supposed to do in footnotes. When you cite a website, you're supposed to say the date when you accessed it, because there's always changes being made. So you have to, so it's the date that you looked at it. So he says, access January 5th, 2025. So I wrote, that's impossible, because I bought this book in September of 2024. So that's clearly an error. So, and it wasn't corrected there, still nobody caught it. So that, those are, you know, like, I find like annoying things there, and I will, when he writes about, but more importantly, when he's very, very critical about Judaism in this chapter. And I notice, and sometimes when people write, you look at the footnotes and you see what's the basis of their information. That's what he's talking about information technology, right? So when I look at his footnotes, I see that either, because he's quoting stuff from the Talmud, you know, and he's quoting, because he's talking about halacha and Jewish and rabbinic Judaism, the Mishnah and the Talmud in this chapter. We'll look at some of those sections. So in it, he quotes the Talmud, and he says, tractate, again, it's a different page numbers in there, but it's footnote 29, which in the first edition is page 426. He says, Tractate Eruvin in Babylonian Talmud, chapter 13a, and then he gives a website. So the fact that he gives a website says, oh, he doesn't have an actual book of the Talmud. But that's not the problem. The problem is he says chapter 13a. That's not a chapter site. That doesn't make any sense. 13a is the folio. It's not the chapter. So he should have just said, and he doesn't say, but you have to say, he says Tractate Eruvin, he should have said Eruvin 13a, or Babylonian Talmud Eruvin 13a is the proper citation. The fact that he says chapter 13a means either he has no idea how to look up something in the Talmud, or he doesn't care, and his research assistant doesn't know how to look things up in the Talmud, that they just found it somewhere on a website and they just typed it down. And it happens again in footnote 39, when he says, for the Talmudic origin of such beliefs, see Tractate Shabbat in Babylonian Talmud, chapter 119b. Makes no sense. Because again, 119b is a folio page, it's not a chapter. So I just, so I wrote in my margin there, this implies that he's illiterate in rabbinic literature, which is funny because he's talking about being able to read literature and read text. Okay, I notice these kind of things, but it's important because it shows that, look, I mean, what's great about Harari is he knows so much about so many things. But then when he's writing about rabbinic literature, which is something that I'm trained in, and I want to say, how can he say these things? I look at the footnotes, it's clear he doesn't know what he's talking about. So that's my, you can see that when you see how it corrects, because he proves his own point because he's making errors. Right. So how does he prove his own point? So what's the thesis of the chapter? That's okay. You just in this case. Yeah.
That it depends either on who's giving it,
Right.
who's using it,
Right.
how you're using it,
Right.
what you're doing, and he is falling into his own.
Right, and there's something, in a sense, you're written in a book, it's written by one of the smartest people in the world, it has a lot of footnotes in the back, it's published by Random House, it must be correct, right? Right, because how could Random House not have someone who could check the footnotes that knows the proper citation of rabbinic literature? I guess they don't, so, yeah.
There was a big error in social media, and so it relates to this, in that the Japanese Vogue printed the star with 6 fingers.
Uh-huh.
And then, would you consider that an error? And then they corrected it. But what if AI thought, or that error became, the star now has 6 fingers on her left hand?
The star,
That's an error.
what star?
Whoever was on the cover. I forget her name, I think it was like Ariana Grande, Rihanna.
Oh, the
They
star,
printed it with 6 fingers, and nobody really noticed. And that's an error.
Ah, okay.
That doesn't
yeah,
matter.
yeah.
The fact is that
Right.
an error was created.
Right, so that's what so that's good, and that's what he talks about, right? He has this long section of chapter about witches, right? And he says that the witch trials, explode exponentially, the hundreds and hundreds of people who were executed for being witches, and it was because of the spread, because of the invention of the printing press. He said because the spread of technology, and you can spread things that are false. false ideas, So yeah, and it's exactly like that. Sometimes it's just silly, right? Like it's not relevant. Sometimes it spreads good things like the scientific, scientific ideas. Other times it spreads very dangerous things. So, and that's what his point is, that the technology of spreading information, and that's the main points in the book, which is an important point, right, is not only for good, but it can be used for terrible things too.
What's that called when the fact, when the fiction becomes fact, when the subject is
Something, yeah. To look it up.
becomes fact.
Google it, you'll find it. Yeah. Okay, so let me start this chapter. So I want to go to the second page of the chapter, on page 71. So he says right at the beginning, he says, in our personal lives, religion can fulfill many different functions, like providing solace or explaining the mysteries of life, okay? But historically, the most important function of religion has been to provide superhuman legitimacy for the social order, okay? Religions like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism propose that their ideas and rules were established by an infallible superhuman authority and are therefore free from all possibility of error and should never be questioned or changed by fallible human beings. So I just think that is 100% inaccurate. He's putting a thesis that's no basis to that. It's his theory. What's missing, interestingly, from that list of religion is Buddhism, which is the only religion he talks about in *Sapiens*, because secular Israelis love Buddhism, right? And Buddhism is sort of the anti-religion religion. So secular Israelis who are brought up very allergic to traditional religion in a Orthodox Jewish, where there's an established Orthodox, I should say synagogue, not church, right? So they'll go. So Buddhism is sort of, if you want a spiritual search, that's why so many Israelis are learning about Buddhism, and they also spend time in Thailand, and so there's that reaction there. So it's very interesting that Buddhism is missing. But he says religions like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, those are the bad religions, because those are premised on the idea that there is an infallible superhuman authority that tells you what to do. And I don't know that that's the basis of religion. At the very next sentence, the section taking humans out of the loop. At the heart of every religion lies the fantasy of connecting to a superhuman and infallible intelligence. This is why, as we shall explore in chapter 8, studying the history of religion is highly relevant to present-day debates about AI. In the history of religion, a recurrent problem is how to convince people that a certain dogma indeed originated from an infallible superhuman source. Even if in principle I'm eager to submit to the God's will, how do I know what the gods really want? So that's his interpretation of religion, which is, again, I suggest it's influenced from a very fundamentalist understanding of what religion is, which doesn't reflect religion in general, right? The sense that this is what God said, and our only job is to get it right and not get it wrong, because God's will is crystal clear, and we just have to understand it because we are infallible, but God is perfect. And I don't think that is the way that anthropologists will define a religion, when there's a whole field of anthropology and comparative religion. The interpretation that was most influential for me when I was in seminary was proposed by the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, he had articulated more than anyone else that what religion does is it attempts to create order out of chaos, creates a system of understanding the world where there's a sense to how things work. So one does not feel lost in a world where we're exposed to what otherwise appears to be random acts, some of which are good and some of which are bad. And if you use that interpretation, that's right there in the very first chapter of the Bible, right, where it says there's tohu vavohu, there's chaos, and God organizes things, and the water stays here, and the earth stays here. And that's why when things break down, that's the story of the flood, which is not only in our Bible, but was also in the Babylonian traditions, because what the idea of a flood, and we know about it in personal experience too, is that undoes the order of the world. The water is supposed to stay where it is, and land is supposed to stay. And when water encroaches on land, it causes lots of problems, and it can, from annoyance and loss of property to tragedy and catastrophe, So that's why the idea of a flood is so important in religious scriptures, because it's about the precariousness of how the world works, right? And that's why the rainbow is important at the end of the Noah story, because it stands for that breach, that covenant, that, this is just, the world works in a certain way, and it usually follows these rules. So my point is that so what religion is an understanding of there being some sense of order in the world, which is not so different than the scientific process, which is just trying to find out what are the rules for how things work in the world. So it's if you understand religion that way, it's the same kind of a thing, right? Whereas Harari understands it as diametrically opposed, and he talks about science later in this chapter, and he talks about the tension between science and religion, that religion is an infallible, this is what God said. Science is a constant error-correcting approach that understands that our understanding can always be fallible, and that's why we have to keep etching away our net. I'll come back to that, but okay, quick question. God does not play dice with the universe. Right, that's the idea, exactly. Yeah.
So it's very interesting to me that these secular Israelis, including Harari maybe, have turned to Buddhism to find that order that they seek, that all humans seek in their
Yeah.
DNA, when they have the Jewish religion right in front of them.
Right.
With all the beauty and.
Why do they look elsewhere when you have the beauty of Judaism? Right, again, it's not, right, I mean, I don't know what Harari, yes, I don't know if Harari himself is, right, but I'm just saying, implication is there, because in Sapiens, it's only Buddhism that's there. But
They did it to ourselves.
that's because of the nature of how religion is discussed in public, that when you have, it's the reason why, the wisdom of our founding fathers, I would say, is to keep religion and state separate, because when you have a coercive power behind a state, behind religion, then it becomes political, and then you either accept it or you don't, and it becomes polarizing. And he talks about that in the book. He talks about some totalitarian societies and how truth is controlled the government, but he doesn't take religion into that. He kind of sees religion as he's trying to talk about chapters in the development of how we process information, and in his perspective, and we talked about this last week also, that the religious perspective is strong because it's based upon a interpretation, a cosmology of how the world works, which we know is no longer true, so we have to move beyond that, whereas rather than understanding it as a model that made sense in one time, and, if we understand things scientifically different than Isaac Newton, it doesn't mean that we're not scientists anymore, or he's not. It just means that new models replace older models, it's frustrating for me that he doesn't include all of human understanding in that same process, but that's because he's coming from an anti-religious perspective, yeah.
Doesn't he refer later on in other books, including some famous atheists, that even though they don't believe in religion, they feel that the religion has been a benefit to civilization because it brought order?
Yes, but for him, I think the way he understands it is that it plays a role, but that we're beyond that role. Right? So, and a lot of people feel that way today, and that might be why the mainstream religions keep shrinking, right? So that's, so I know I'm reacting just from my own perspective, right? Because if I'm a rabbi of a non-fundamentalist religious community, then it's my job to say religion is relevant. So I'm reading it from that perspective. We all read it from our perspectives, right? If you're reading it from a scientific perspective, you might have a different take. But we have multiple perspectives, right? Our different identities overlap in that sense. So so there is a way of, and even that is limited, right? So he's saying, yes, it does play a role because you need to first have the story, and then you need to have the book, and then and the book is this, is perfect because the advance of the writing over the oral story is that then it can't be misrepresented because everyone has the same thing. But then he talks about the fact, but it is misrepresented. First of all, because there's scribal errors, and he has this whole section on the making of the Hebrew Bible, the whole issue, the whole long process of canonization, which goes into the Bible, which doesn't go in the Bible, and then there's scribal errors, and then there's different translations. So there's no but nevertheless, the institution, the synagogue, the church, the religious institution says, no, this is the official version, and this is the official version. So that's, it's meant to be a correction of oral technology, which is too fallible, because you know how, in class you used to tell you a telephone game where everyone whispers something to the next person, and by the time it gets to the end, it's a very different sentence. So the written text is supposed to fix that, but then it doesn't. So he's saying we have to recognize that there can be errors in that stage of technology also. So that's where he says that the conventional religions fail in that sense, and that they don't, they can't recognize the fallibility, and they don't know how to correct it, which again I think he's wrong about. Yeah.
First of all, he neglects to say that the process of writing this book was the same as that process, where he corrected and this and that. In fact, in the beginning of the book somewhere, he says, I said this in Sapiens, but what I really meant was...
Yeah. Right.
To be fair, he's going through the very process
Yeah.
of Slam.
Right, and he's the same person. Whereas in the Bible, it's written by different people over 1,000 years. Right? It's a long spread. So in the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Bibles are small. It's still different people, but it's over only a few centuries rather than a whole millennium, in terms of it coming together. Okay, so then he has this section called the Institute, which starts in 78. The institution strikes back. So it's sort of a play on The Empire Strikes Back. But he's saying the institution and that's the sense of the turn, right? How the institution is going to assume that authority. And he talks about the development of the Talmud, the mission of the Talmud, saying that because there's all these different arguments of what the Torah means, then they just make a new book, the Mishnah, and they make a new book, the Talmud. They just replace one book with another book, but they still have this infallible sense. It's all about what the book means, which again I think is missing the whole point. If you're cranking out new books, it's the same thing like a new preface that's probably in the paperback, or editions where you're articulating. So he says the dream of bypassing fallible human institutions through the technology of the Holy Book never materialized. With each iteration, the power of the rabbinical institution only increased. Trust in the infallible book turned into trust the humans who interpret the book. Judaism was shaped by the Talmud far more than by the Bible, and rabbinical arguments about the interpretation of the Talmud became even more important than the Talmud itself. So what he's saying there, it's where you have in Judaism, where you have the rabbis that say this is, to make a decree, or in Islam where there's a fatwa, that this is a decree, or in Catholicism where the Pope says a papal encyclical that says this is what to believe, the dogma, that in all cases it's the institution is taking the place of the text and or sort of becomes the text, right, and saying that this is still infallible. And what I think is the total miss there, and I understand why he would interpret that way, because you have, in those systems, and especially in Israeli Judaism, that for most Orthodox Judaism, where you have a chief rabbinate, and you have these gadol, these 3 or 4 authorities that are the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi authorities. They make a decree, and that's considered infallible. So he's resisting that sort of as a non-modern or an anti-modern way to deal with information, right? But what I think he fails to understand is that is the self-correcting technology, right? And that, right, that the idea of, you think about the church, right? So, and he talks about the Pope, and he'll expand it, but my understanding is that the whole doctrine of papal infallibility is a self-correcting technology, because it means that if the church was interpreting something wrong in the past, the current Pope can say, no, this is the truth, and that corrects what the church did before. So it's not a fundamentalism that you can't disagree. It's actually a means of correcting a dogma that is no longer considered true or accurate. It's the way that the church is able to adapt to new circumstances. So and we'll get to that, but the most important example for us as Jews is the Vatican II, the part of the Vatican II decision, Nostra Aetate, which has to do with the relations of the Catholic Church with other religions, and a long part of that specifically with Judaism, where it says that, in no uncertain terms, it says that the teachings of the church for the last 2,000 years, that the Jewish people are guilty for the crucifixion and are to be demonized, as enemies of the church, that this is an error, this is not the true meaning of the Gospels, and that Jews are our elder brother and blah, blah, blah. So, it just completely reconfigures the relationship of the church with the Jewish people. And that's a correction. And it's only because the Pope had the authority to call a Vatican Council and to approve, and it's not the Pope himself, right? It's a deliberative process, but the procedure which allows the Pope, and then once the Pope says something as a papal decree, and this, if you're a good Catholic, it's infallible. So you can't say, no, you can't change the way that, this is the way Pope says, yes, I am, I'm the Pope. It's good to be the Pope. So that's my point. He just doesn't seem to understand, and he tries to wiggle out of it, and I'll show you how he does as we go through a bit here. But first he makes fun of sort of traditional Jewish practice in a sense. One is he talks about kashrut. And this is the bottom of 79, beginning of 80, when he says, it says in the Holy Book, Exodus 23:19, you shall not kick a young goat in its mother's milk. Right? So some people interpret this literally, if you slaughter the young goat, don't cook it in the milk of its mother. That's all that the Torah says. It's fine to cook it in the milk of an unrelated goat or the milk of a cow. Other people interpret this prohibition much more broadly to mean that meat and dairy products should never be mixed, so you are not allowed to have a milkshake after fried chicken. As unlikely as this may sound, most rabbis rule that the second interpretation is the correct one, even though chickens don't lactate. So his point, even though chickens don't lactate, means chicken is not meat. Right? Yes, we know, right? Chicken is not meat. A bird is not a mammal. We all know that. Nevertheless, Jewish law evolved to a way that that's where the law is. And the point is, it's an evolution. And if he could just acknowledge that you have an evolution of practice, that goes against exactly what he's trying to say. That means that the original biblical text is not etched in stone, right? It's not infallible, because in fact later generations reinterpret it to expand it. Sometimes things are expanded, sometimes things are limited, that it's constantly changing, and he doesn't, he just makes fun of it. Hold on, the other place he makes fun of it is he talks about a Shabbos elevator. So he says somehow they decided that, pressing buttons is work, and he puts it in quotations without explaining that work is a series of actions. He gives it a very unsophisticated saying, and he says, therefore, is it okay? It's not okay to press electrical buttons of an elevator on Shabbat. Orthodox say no. As the rabbis are, pressing an electrical button is work. Does this mean that elderly Jews living in a Brooklyn high-rise must climb 100 steps to their apartment in order to avoid working on the Sabbath? No, that's why Orthodox Jews invented the Sabbath elevator. And then he says where it stops on every floor, and then he says in AI it's even easier, because if you have a smart elevator and you live in the condo, the smart elevator can see your face imprint, and then it knows what floor to take you to. You don't have to do anything. All you have to do is walk in and walk out. So he's making fun of Orthodoxy there, but what he could also see is that those new interpretations are not silly, but rather they're corrections, because it doesn't make sense that you would have to walk up 100 flights, and that in the ancient times, multi-floor buildings were at most 3 floors high, right? You had 3-floor Roman buildings. The only buildings that were higher than 3 floors is like the Colosseum. And it's not, so the idea of having 100-floor and there are no 100 floors in Brooklyn, right? That's a city, but anyway, that's a new thing, right? And also an elevator is a new thing. So it's the elevator that is the technology that allows people to get to apartments in higher levels. So then you find a way to then correct the tradition so that it finds a way for people to still observe Shabbat and do it that way. And that's why they do it that way. And that's a correction, right? Which he doesn't understand. Okay, so,
There's some pretty tall
yes.
buildings in Brooklyn.
There are, yeah, okay, yeah.
Sure, there's
I don't know, yeah, there are some pretty tall, where they definitely do need the elevators, that is true. So, let me move along, bottom of page 88. So he's talking about then Christianity, after he he takes Judaism apart, then he goes to Christianity. So he's an equal opportunity disruptor, right? And he says, the Christians trusted church, even though there were different opinions of what goes in the New Testament, what doesn't go, and how to understand it. The church said, this is what is in the Bible. These are, and this is how it's understood. So the canonization of the New Testament, just like the canonization of the Hebrew Bible, went hand in hand with the creation of a unified Christian church. Christians trusted church officials because of what they read in the New Testament. They had faith in the New Testament because this is what the bishops told them to read. The attempt to invest all authority in an infallible superhuman technology led to the rise of a new and extremely powerful human institution, which is called the church, right? And then now he goes and he's equal. He's just as unset with the church as he is with the rabbinate, right? And he goes on about that, and then he gets into this understanding about the scientific revolution. So then he jumps to the early modern period when you have the invention of movable type. So the invention of movable type is the next extraordinary revolution in the technology of spreading information after the invention of writing. So because now you don't have to handwrite everything. So it exponentially increases the amount of people you can reach. It's kind of the invention of the internet today, right? It's the same kind of exponential jump in the ability to reach people. So the argument that he's critiquing that is often given is that the reason why the scientific revolution happens and begins in the 1500s in Renaissance Italy and early modern Europe is because of the invention of the printing press, because this allows scientists to spread information and communicate with each other, that this is the good thing about being able to spread information. And his point, which is a good critique of that, he says, well, first of all, he makes the point, it spreads Galileo's books, but what it also spreads is books about witchcraft, those were much more better bestsellers than Galileo's books. A lot more people read those, and it caused a much greater change in people's lives in the scientific revolution, okay, because there were all these witch hunt crazes, so the fact, he says this succinctly, at bottom of A92, print allowed the rapid spread not only of scientific facts, but also of religious fantasies, fake news, and conspiracy theories. So he's giving a wink to our own day, right? That, we complain about fake news that's spread through social media. Well, it's the same thing with the print, with the printing press. Same thing happens. It's not a new thing, right? Yes, it's different because social media is not, regulated, we would say, in the same sense. If things are published, reputable, news is spread by reputable journalists, or a book is published, you know who the publisher is. And you know to trust the publisher. You know to trust the journal, that this is what we call, a peer-reviewed journal, as opposed to someone just put something on their Facebook page, right? There's a way. Right, but his argument is that those distinctions exist today. You had those who understood the distinctions, recognized those distinctions in the 16th century, but everyone else just bought a book that was peddled around the corner. So the danger of misinformation being spread is not a new thing. And I don't know if that's comforting or not, And his best thing, and he goes into detail with his story about witchcraft, the specific book. He says it's Kramer's book, Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, a do-it-yourself guidebook to exposing and killing witches. He explains in detail, how it works, and it just caused a terrible, spread of the increase of hundreds of people were executed because we're accused of witchcraft. I'm looking. There was one great. Oh yeah, he has this, and he says it's not objective. It's an intersubjective reality, which is that was the idea I was talking about last week, the previous chapter, that it's, you have the intersubjective reality is where there's something that different people agree with, and it doesn't mean it's objectively true. It can be based on a false narrative, misinformation. It's just something that people accept. So that was the case with these witchcraft trials. So he says, it's on page 98, the witch hunts illustrate the dark side of creating an information sphere. As with rabbinical discussions of the Talmud and scholastic discussions of Christian scriptures, got to get that in there, right? Because those are also intersubjective realities, because they're about things that God said that are not scientifically true. The witch hunts were fueled by an expanding ocean of information that, instead of representing reality, created a new reality. Witches were not an objective reality. Nobody, this is a great line. Nobody in early modern Europe had sex with Satan, or was capable of flying on broomsticks and creating hailstorms. But witches became an intersubjective reality. Like money, witches were made real by exchanging information about witches. So it's just like money, currency, which is an idea that people just have to agree on. It's nothing objective that, you take, there's nothing objective about the fact that this piece of paper is worth 20 times more than this piece of paper. It's just something we agree on. It's the paper is exactly the same, the ink is exactly the same. So it's the same thing with sovereignties, we talked about with nations, it's the same thing with religious truths, and it's the same thing about witches. If people can just agree to it and the information is spread, then it's there, yeah.
But one thing he leaves out is, what about the case where then people don't believe anything? I don't believe what you say is the truth, I don't believe what you say is the truth, I believe nothing. So then we go to anarchy. What do we do
Yeah.
to solve the anarchy problem? Religion.
Okay, that's a circle. That's a
Does
circle.
complete-
Maybe, but you never had anarchy. You never really were. I mean, it never really spread unless you. I mean, he talks about communism and fascism as those are his two cases, in the 20th century where you had systems that spread misinformation that millions and millions of people followed. So those are the examples. Yeah. So those are the examples. You could others. Those are the ones that made it. Anarchy, you never had anarchy that took millions of people doing things. But communism did that, fascism did that, and that's where his implication is, talking about the dangers of populism today, when,
People don't believe anything.
maybe,
Today's
I don't know.
paper reports that a lady is suing social media, I don't know which social media.
Okay.
Because her daughter overdosed based
Yeah.
on whatever she was.
Right, so that was the social media, I mentioned that actually, I remember on Rosh Hashanah, I thought it was a case where, so they were suing the AI, the chatbot, because it encouraged the child tragically took his life,
Everything that they
right, so that's information again, and how the information is being presented, and that the idea of the suits is that there have, and that's, and he's gonna talk about that later in the book, that there has, it's not the end of the world, we just have to we have to understand the dangers, right, and be able to put controls on that. So we'll get to that in April, but Stacey, go ahead. Yeah.
But, I'm glad you brought the legal piece, because that could be a whole nother book, about how the legal system's gonna handle
Yeah.
all of these cases about this new reality, which is the internet. But also, point number two, when you talk, or when I read that book, I always think about access and how, the population, I think about now everybody in the population has access to information.
Mm-hmm.
And even with the discovery of and preparation of the printing press, not everybody could read, like 50%
Right.
of
I didn't know about that.
I think
Yeah.
about how AI and all
Right.
information study and collection is going to make.
Right, and that's why it's an exponential spread, right? That, all you need, that it's available that many more. Even the printing press, you had to know how to read, and you had to be able to buy a book. But, in terms of the spread of these, misinformation about witches, all you needed was one person in the pub, to have bought this book and read it or heard about it, and then people talk about it. So it is an exponentially more dangerous, which is what he talks about. Yeah, but his point is, it's the same basic idea. It's just exponentially that much more effective. So he talks about then when the witches stuff, and he has this section called the Spanish Inquisition to the Rescue. Right, he's being tongue-in-cheek there because he's saying it's the Spanish Inquisition that acts against the witchcraft, because then he quotes this inquisitor who said, I haven't found any evidence of any of this, of any of this stuff, So it's Salazar Frias, the Inquisitor, who says there are neither witches nor bewitched until they were being written about. And his point is that it's an intersubjective sphere. So then he writes the history of early modern. This is page 101. The history of early modern Europe, which the history of the early modern European witch craze demonstrates that releasing barriers to the flow of information doesn't necessarily lead to the discovery and spread of truth. It can just as easily lead to the spread of lies and fantasies and to the creation of toxic information spheres. More specifically, a complete free market of ideas may incentivize the dissemination of outrage and sensationalism at the expense of truth. And he's talking about social media there. He's saying if that could happen in the early modern period, books, all the more so today, right, when everyone has access to phones and computers, so disinformation is just more spread. And again, it goes back to his main thesis at the beginning of the book, that just the availability of the internet to make, all we have to do is make information accessible to everyone, and then they're going to have the information, and if they have the information, they'll make the right decisions. And he says usually the opposite happens, and this is his example. But that's a good thing. It's a good thing, right? It does good things and bad things, right? It does good things and bad things. It's interesting that he gives this whole discussion here about the witchcraft. He could have also spoken about the same scholarship's been done in the history of the blood libel, is one of the important chapters in the history of anti-Semitism, right? Where it's the idea that Jews torture and kill a young Christian boy, they bleed him, they take the blood, and that's what they need to bake their matzah. There's no objective reality in that whatsoever, but it's this long calumny that spreads over 8,000 years in Europe, and it has to do because it's an inversion of the Eucharist ritual, so it's a Christian sort of a negative perception, Christian, and there's all different theories of how it developed. But what's important is that it specifically, again, in the early modern period with the invention of the printing press is what spreads the dangers of blood libels, because they spread more and they affect that many more people, and because people are reading these books that are filled with misinformation, and that's how it spreads. The church, just like the Inquisition and the witch trials, are the good guys in the story of the blood libels, and that is, again, the correcting mechanism, the central authority of the church against local bishops or priests who, were investigating a blood libel in their parish or in their town. So what happened was that Jews or the local or the episcopate would go to the Vatican, would ask for an investigation, and eventually the Pope would order it to be stopped. So again, that's the central powerful church, which he sees as a bad guy, is actually the good guy in the history of blood libels, because that was what every time a blood libel came, the Jewish community immediately sent a delegation, go to Rome as quickly as you can and get an audience with the Pope, pay as many bribes as you need to, and then the Pope would eventually schedule a hearing, or he would put a cardinal in charge of it, and then they would call in the person from that place, and it would take a while. It sometimes would take half a year. And we would say this is frustratingly slow. Well, guess what? Our judicial system today is slower, right? So it's just the wheels of justice are always slow. But eventually you had those central institutions that were able to establish order, and work things out. Okay, so then on page 102, he starts this section, the discovery of ignorance. And this is where he talks about the church versus science, religion versus science. So he says on 103, a church typically told people to trust it because it possessed the absolute truth in the form of an infallible holy book. A scientific institution, in contrast, gained authority because it had strong self-correcting mechanisms that exposed and rectified the errors of the institution itself. It was these self-correcting mechanisms, not the technology of printing, that were the engine of the scientific revolution. So that's his theory, right? That it's not the printing press, what was new about science was the putting, not accepting a truth that is handed down, but test the scientific method, where you test a hypothesis with experimentation and evidence, and then you see if the evidence supports your hypothesis or not. That's the basic scientific method. And that approach, and that's the same thing happens in intellectual history in the Enlightenment. There's a famous essay by Immanuel Kant from the 1790 something, where he says, what is the Enlightenment? He says what the Enlightenment is that it means that we no longer accept as a truth something that's handed down by the church. We have to reason it, right? We have to question it and reason it, so that when it's and that's the true source of authority, right? So we don't just accept the fact that this is the right thing to do, but if we think it through with reason, right? How do I know that I shouldn't steal the money in your wallet? Well, you could say it because it says in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not steal. But what Kant is saying, I have to reason it out. That it doesn't seem, if I reason it out, it's unreasonable for me to think it's okay for me to steal your wallet, because then it would be okay for you to steal what's in my wallet. So if I want security of my own possessions, it's reasonable thing is to understand that we shouldn't steal from each other, so that you don't need the religious truth handed down. Now, Kant wasn't anti-religion. He was saying that a lot of religious truths are reasonable, but we can apply reason. So that's, in a theological, philosophical sense, the same thing what the scientific process is doing in terms of objective reality. I don't think that the printing press is irrelevant. I think that for the scientific process to work well, it means that different scientists need to be in communication with each other, right? So that they can compare different experimental data. And the results need to be known. So that's what you need. So that's why you need the expansions in the information technology, communication technology, in order to move science along, right? And he doesn't seem to acknowledge that. So, and the other thing is that critiquing thing is not something that's specifically new to scientists in the early modern period. It's not something that's unknown in religion as well. That, he even talked about rabbinic Judaism when he said, more than what it says in the Torah, rabbis just debate over about the Talmud, but that debate about religious texts is exactly the continually subjecting religious truths to critique, right? It's what the Talmud does all the time. When the Talmud says, this is the law in the Mishnah, but how do we know this? On what basis is this the law? And they keep coming up with challenges and challenges and challenges until they finally narrow it down to say, this is where, the law ends up. And it's not so much focused on what the halacha is. What the Talmud is just a intellectual method to constantly question something, which is this similar kind of approach, right? That it's the opposite of accepting something as just infallibly true. If the Mishnah were just accepted, then there would be no Gemara. It would just say, I don't need to ask how the Mishnah knows it, I just accept it, which is what he implies. Because he says, but Orthodox Jews believe the Mishnah was spoken to Moses on Mount Sinai until eventually it was written down in the Mishnah. But that's actually the opposite of the rabbinic process.
Also deliberate constructions of misinformation. Like in wartime today, we see the allegations of genocide because
Right.
somebody wants to undermine.
Sometimes misinformation is often deliberate, for a purpose. Right, based on the power of the government. Yeah, can undo what's established. That's true. And that's right. And that's, again, the danger of the power to communicate, Yeah, yeah. So, okay, so then he says the scientific revolution was launched by the discovery of ignorance, as opposed to religions of the book, assumed they had access to an infallible source of knowledge. The Christians had the Bible, the Muslims had the Quran, the Hindus had the Vedas, the Buddhas had the Tipitaka. He even says Buddhists are not perfect either there, so that's good. Scientific culture has no comparable holy book, nor does it claim that any of its heroes are infallible prophets, saints, or geniuses. The scientific project starts by rejecting the fantasy of infallibility and proceeding to construct an information network that takes error to be inescapable. So, and then that's why he says, so what science has that religion doesn't have is what he calls the self-correcting mechanism. I'm going to go a little faster here because we're almost out of time. So he says, an information technology, The self-correcting mechanism, this is page 104, is the polar opposite of the Holy Book. The Holy Book is supposed to be infallible. The self-correcting mechanism embraces fallibility. Again, I just think he's right. I think he's 100% wrong there. And then he says, and then his first example is then he talks about when the Allies defeated and dismantled the Nazi regime, this was not a self-correcting mechanism left to its own devices. Germany would not have denazified itself. But when a scientific journal publishes a paper correcting a mistake that appeared in a previous paper, that's an example of institutional self-correction. I don't understand that at all. How do we know that Germany would not have denazified itself if the Allies hadn't forced it? How do we know that? You know, history goes in cycles, right? And his people and communities are constantly, you know, it happens in this country, right? That we say, and it's probably going to happen, the midterm elections, the standard, the president's expecting it to happen, right? The party that's not in power, that's not in the White House, usually wins the midterm elections in Congress. That's self-correcting, right? So that's the normal thing. You know, there's always going back and forth. I wrote, is in history, in a sense, a self-correcting mechanism, in that sense, because things go in cycles. He writes, institutions die without self-correcting mechanisms. And now he takes on the Catholic Church. And he says, never in history did God allow the majority of church leaders to make a serious mistake in their interpretation of the Holy Book. The principle is common to many religions. Jewish orthodoxy accepted the possibility that the rabbis who composed the Mishnah and Talmud might have erred in personal matters, but when they came to decree a religious doctrine, God ensured they would make no mistake. And that's his saying, yes, whenever they correct themselves, it means that it was a human error, but the book was infallible. They just misunderstood it. So they're not really accepting the fallibility of the book. What I think he misses is that that's just a pious way of saying I'm rewriting the book. You know? So, and then he says about the church, he says, you know, popes were careful to shift responsibility away from scriptures and from the church as an institution. Instead, the blame was always laid on the shoulders of individual churchmen who misinterpreted scriptures. And, you know, again, my point is that's how it works, right? You can't say, I'm throwing out the Bible, so you say, we humans misunderstood the Bible, but that's a pious way of amending the Bible, of making it say something else. He talks about, you know, how the Pope, you know, papal apologies for different things here against indigenous peoples in Canada. He talks about, it says, mention the Jews. Yeah. Then he says, then I'm up to page 109. When asked about the church's more generous attitude to Jews or women, popes imply that was always what the church really taught, even if some individual churchmen previously failed to understand it. But again, that's how it works, right? That's the system. So it's like he's trying to have it both ways. He's saying, yes, they do change things, but when they do, they're just saying that it was human fallibility, but the problem is that the book is, but if you can change what the book means, then you're self-correcting it. And I don't know why he just has a block there. And I think it's because of his context. It's not just living in Israel, but it's a part of that. And he compares that to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual when he says they make a correction. So then he talks about how homosexuality is understood, which is very personal for him because he's an out gay man. So he says that in the 1952 version of it said that it was a pathology, and then it was changed in 2013. So, and a little earlier, but then a full change in 2013. He goes through the different stages of the redefinition, but he says it's the scientific community that just says we were wrong and then changes it. Whereas you never have that in the Bible, in a religion. So he says on page 112, he says, many of the most powerful and admired religious leaders of recent times, such as Pope Benedict XVI, Chief Rabbi of Israel David Lau, and the Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran. Can't believe you put those three in the same category. Have won fame and supporters by strict resistance to new ideas and trends like feminism. But in science, it works the other way around. And then he says how, it is true in science. I mean, I think he's being overly optimistic about science and overly negative about religion, right? When scientists come up with new ideas, they're shunned if they go against orthodoxies of the discipline. And he says, well, eventually, though, if they make enough evidence, they'll be accepted. And when they're not in the Soviet Union, well, that's because the Soviet institutions weren't real scientific institution. So he sort of tries to get out of it that way. And because they don't have the self-correcting mechanism. But again, so you understand what I've been trying to say, right? That he's trying to make a distinction between religious institutions, between totalitarian institutions, right, totalitarian authorities, and a modern, like a scientific liberal community that's able to self-correct itself and has the potential to do that. So I just want to give you two examples of why I think he's wrong. So this idea of, one of the most influential books for me, it's an extremely dense, very difficult book to read, by my halacha teacher, called The Halachic Process, a Systemic Analysis by Joel Roth. It was published in 1986, and it's basically an explanation of how the system of Jewish law works. And his argument is that Jewish law works like all other legal systems, that they're premised on an idea that you have a basic fundamental law, and then you have the secondary, the legislation and interpretation that's always changing. But that the authorities of the law in any age have the authority there's always an amendment power. And that it's something that in a religious system, if you believe that it's authored by God, then you want to approach it with fear and trembling. But nevertheless, the rabbis, and he argues this, with hundreds of support throughout the whole history of rabbinic interpretation from the Talmud through the 19th century. And he says that of course the rabbis have the ability to change the way that the Torah is understood in any particular circumstance. Whether they exercise the amendment power is different, but they have the amendment power that in every legal system, there has to be an amendment power of what he calls the Grundnorm, which is based on the legal principles, legal philosophy is following, that otherwise the system can't evolve. And he says that, in fact, the Torah, and this is admitted in the Talmud, that the Torah has an amendment clause. And it's in the book of Deuteronomy when it says if you have a question about the law and you don't know the answer, you go to the priests and the authority and the judges in your time and you follow what they say. So that is understood, interpreted, meaning that the rabbis have the authority it's not what the Torah says, it's the rabbis have the authority to explain what it means. And that and that's the amendment power. And that's what Harari does not, and he clearly doesn't understand that, right? Because he says the whole basis of religious systems is it's infallible, no amendment power. So he's not the only one who misunderstands. And I'll finish with this. So I picked up, this is a new book also. So Jill Lepore is a Harvard law and history professor. She wrote a book called These Truths, which was a few years ago, that was a bestseller, Great History of the United States. And this is her next book, and it's called We the People, A History of the U.S. Constitution. She's an amazing writer, great writer. And what she does here is she's basically starting from the beginning of the writing of the Constitution through to contemporary times. She said that the Constitution would never have been passed if it didn't have the amendment clause, right, which allows it to be amended. And she says that part of the crisis facing the American Republic since the 1970s is that we haven't had any serious discussion of amending the Constitution. Since the last substantive amendment was that you have the right to vote at 18. That was the last significant amendment. And she says that that's a stultifying, right, of the system that is a danger, and she basically, the history is a history of all, from the beginning to the end, all the attempts at amending it. She starts right off saying the very first 3 words, we the people, is the most amended phrase in American history, because we keep redefining who the people is, right, and who it excludes and who it includes. Many different reasons. It's a part of it. A lot of the book is a critique of originalism, with the sense that, the Constitution means a very specific thing. And she's saying, no, it's rather, it was intended, and through most of its history until the 1970s, that you can, that you have the authority, either through legislative actual amendments or through judicial reinterpretation, which is the other approach, which we still do, right? Where yeah. Yeah.
Yes, but aren't isn't the Supreme Court to the Constitution as the rabbis are to the religion?
It should.
At any point.
Right. It's the same idea, right? And that's what you said. That's one approach. I mean, she says that but the debate on the Supreme Court is whether the whole debate about originalism is that whether the Supreme Court can do that, right? And that some say yes, and others say, well, no, we really can't. So that's the debate that she engages in that. The whole book is about that debate. Yeah, clearly courts, when they determine without, how, and this is the thing, and what Harari says in this book, when he criticizes, the Pope, he says, the Pope can apologize, but the Pope is never going to say, the gospel was wrong, I'm going to reissue a new version of the Gospel of Matthew. Right? And this was something that when in the Law Committee Rabbinical Assembly, when we were talking about same-sex marriage, and I was involved in the discussions then, one of my more fundamentalist colleagues was saying, how can you reinterpret the halacha to mean something that's the opposite of what it says in Leviticus? What does that mean? That you're going to go into the Torahs in every ark and you're going to etch out the line that says, a man lies with a man, it's an abomination. I said, no, you're missing the whole point. The whole point is that we can interpret what that means in a different way. We don't have to take out the line. So that's judicial reinterpretation, which is the way that amendments work in Jewish law. In American law, you can actually also make an actual amendment, and So, at any rate, what I wanted to just read you this one section here, and she's full of errors also that have to be amended. She's all in favor. I found a mistake that I wrote the editor about. We're talking about the flood in Noah before. She's quoting from a letter of Thomas Jefferson, where hold on, here it is, where she says. Thomas Jefferson wrote, some men look at constitutions with sanctimonious reverence and deem them like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched, which Jefferson was opposing. He was saying it's not sacrosanct. And she wrote Ark of the Covenant, she wrote the wrong Ark, A-R-C, which is so then I gave her the benefit of the doubt, and I checked the source, and I looked up the actual letter from Thomas Jefferson, because maybe it's an archaic spelling. No, it has it with a K there. So I wrote the publisher had a form for Norton to correct it. So of course I sent that in. But here's the problem, and I'll finish with this for today. Okay, so she says, the U.S. Constitution drew from ancient ideas, but it was also something new and truly revolutionary, an 18th century invention, a body of fundamental law drafted and ratified by representatives of an invented polity, a constituency. It's an intersubjective reality, known as the people, binding them to their government by an act of consent. It was meant to transcend ordinary law by establishing fundamental principles, structures, powers, and rights, printed, copied, and circulated among an extraordinary literate population. The Constitution executed a covenant and allowed for the exertion of power over vast distances. Okay, that's great, right? Just finishing up here. But the U.S. Constitution is not a list of commandments. Not like the Code of Hammurabi or the laws of Moses, found etched on tablets, engraved in stone and monument, nor is it a form of scripture, unlike all of these, but very much like the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which has been amended more than 100 times. The Constitution, was meant to be revised, updated, and improved. So she compares that, unlike the scripture where you have something, and then she even talks, where you can't change it. And that's, again, they're not fundamentally different. It's the same thing. And the same things just go in cycles and continue. All right, we have to stop. That was Rabbi Kober telling me my students are waiting downstairs. All right, our next date's the end of March. So we finished basically, this is the big stuff that I disagreed with. I pretty much agree with everything else in the book. So we'll go through and we'll cover kind of more material, not as slow, because we got 2 more sessions. Thank you.
Scientific